Hi, my name is Saikat Bhattacharya and I work with the Developer Technical Services team at Autodesk. This DevTV is the addendum to the Introduction to Revit Programming for Revit 2012. This DevTV provides us some of the migration steps required to run the samples demonstrated in the DevTV Introduction to Revit 2012 Programming Part 1 and 2 in Revit 2012. This will also provide some basic information on what has changed in Revit 2012 API. If you have not watched these DevTVs yet, we recommend that you watch them first. Thankfully, the changes for Revit 2011 to Revit 2012 are quite minor. Now, in order to make the existing code in Revit 2011 DevTVs to run with Revit 2012, we will need to make the following minimal changes. The first change is the Adin manifest file. We need to add a vendor ID tag in the manifest file. This is a compulsory step. Vendor ID is a 4-character symbol which helps identify the maker of the add-in. If you're writing a code for in-house usage, you may specify, for example, ADSK or ADNP, which many of our SDK samples use. If you plan to make your add-in available to other customers, then this should be your RDS or the registered developer symbol that you register at the developer center. The URL to the RDS registration site is shown on the slide. The vendor description tag is optional. It is used to describe the vendor, their legal name, and other pertinent information. Revit will use it to inform the user about the author of the add-in when there is a problem running the add-in. The other change in the Revit 2012 API is the regeneration attribute. In Revit 2012, automatic regeneration mode has been removed, and only the manual regeneration mode is supported. If your add-in makes changes which affects the geometry of elements or even creates geometry elements, you will need to call the document.regenerate method explicitly to be able to access the geometry resulted by your modification or the creation. From the existing code, you can simply remove the regeneration attribute. Revit will not complain if you keep the attribute in the code, but it will simply have no effect. The part 1 of the DevTV also introduces the Adin Wizard of Visual Studio. This is an optional tool that can be used for your convenience. The 2012 version of this wizard has already been made available from the Revit API blog called the Building Coder. You can download it from the URL mentioned on the slide. Additionally, for the samples, we have post-build events populated for your convenience. You might want to modify them as well. To do this, go to the Visual Studio Project's Property Settings, under Build Events, Post-Build Event command line. You can update this to reflect Revit 2012 instead of Revit 2011. This is needed for the samples which contain a post-build settings and are being migrated from Revit 2011 to Revit 2012. Since the DevTV samples also contain start action for the Visual Studio project, we need to update the path of the Revit executable file in the Start External Program Settings in the Debug tab under Visual Studio Project Properties. Performing these above mentioned steps should be enough for DevTV samples to work with Revit 2012 and leverage its new API. So far, we have only explained what are the minimal steps required to make our DevTV samples run with Revit 2012. But there are basic changes in Revit 2012 that you would want to be aware of. I'm going to quickly go through them in this slide. The .NET Framework 4.0 has been used since Revit 2012's release. For the development environment, you could use either Visual Studio 2008 or Visual Studio 2010. We do recommend that the development environment is Visual Studio 2010 with a target framework of 4.0. We can still use Visual Studio 2008 with a target framework of 3.5. However, we cannot debug the plugins using Visual Studio 2008. Binary compatibility is not guaranteed with Revit API yet. So the sample projects need to reference the Revit API DLL and the Revit API UI DLL located in the Revit 2012's installation directory. For more migration related information, please refer to the Revit Platform API Changes and Additions document and in the Revit API CHM file under the What's New in Revit 2012 API Help section. Lastly, we would like to quickly point you to our new self-paced tutorial for a smooth introduction into the programming world and specifically for programming with Revit API. This guide is called the My First Revit plugin. This is a one-stop shop learning path for users who know Autodesk products but are absolutely new to programming. It covers the basics of getting started with Autodesk's Revit.NET API and the C# programming language as well. This guide can be accessed from the URL shown on the slide. This brings us to the end of this short dev TV. Thank you.